In this video, I'll show you how I made some game boards for the game Hex. If you'd like to know how to play Hex, check out my other video, How to Play Hex. I started by selecting some wood from the hardware store. I selected pine boards 30 centimeters wide with a nice grain and with not too many knots. Since most pine is knotty, you might have to search for a while in the store before you find a piece of pine with a big enough space between knots to fit your hex board. Next, I printed out a pattern of my board design and transferred the outlines to the pine boards. At this point, pay attention to the grain of the wood, because the finished boards will look nicer when the grain runs along the length of the board. Also avoid any knots in the wood. Then I used an electric jigsaw to cut out the boards. I used a special fine jigsaw blade that cuts the wood cleanly, so that I don't get a lot of splintering along the edges. By the way, when you put the blade in, you make sure your jigsaw is unplugged, or else you're going to cut off a finger. My jigsaw has a laser guide, which helps with cutting in a perfectly straight line. I used an electric sander to sand down the top, bottom, and especially the sides of each board. This way, you can get rid of any imperfections in the wood, for example if someone dropped a piece of wood in the store. You can also get the sides and corners of the board to be perfectly straight and smooth. The next step is optional, but it is a nice touch. I used a tool called a router to make a rounded edge all around the top of the board. The router has a spinning bit with a special curved shape for making rounded edges. Since the router bit always spins clockwise, you will get a rougher edge on the sides of the board where the router goes against the grain. I used sandpaper to gently smooth out the routed edges. So one of my pieces broke, unfortunately. That piece of wood was cracked even in the store, but I didn't see that when I bought it. But as soon as I started cutting it, this crack started getting bigger and now it's broken apart. But I think I'm going to be able to just glue that back together with carpenter's glue. I'm not going to worry about glue squirting out of these edges because I'll sand it after. I'll have to resand it after I glue it anyway. Okay. Let's take the clamp off. This looks like it attached pretty nicely. Here's a bit of glue protruding. No one will ever notice that that was broken. Then I applied a coat of water-based polyurethane varnish to the entire board, sides, top and bottom. It's important at this point to use water-based varnish because this will be used also in the transfer process when I transfer a printed design to the board later. After the first coat of varnish has dried, the board will feel rough to the touch. That's because all the small wood fibers that were previously soft will have stiffened. So after the first coat of varnish, the entire board needs to be gently sanded with a fine-grained sandpaper. At this point, the purpose is not to reshape the wood, but just to take away the surface roughness. This only needs to be done after the first coat of varnish. After sanding, I applied another coat of varnish and let that one dry as well. Now comes the hard part. I took some sheets of address labels and peeled off the labels. I threw the labels away and kept only the backing paper. It's coated with some kind of waxy substance that is non-stick. Then I used a laser printer to print a mirrored version of my board design onto these sheets. I had to experiment with several different printers because not every laser printer is the same. Also, since my hex boards are larger than one sheet of paper, I had to print the board design in 2 sections. It's important to print the mirror image of the design you want, because when you transfer the design to the wood, it's going to be reversed. Then I applied a layer of water-based varnish to the board and also to the transfer paper. The reason I'm putting varnish both on the board and the paper is to avoid wrinkling. Now I put the transfer paper on the board with the wet side down. Before you do this, you have to measure very carefully so that the design goes exactly in the spot where you want it. After you put the paper on the wood, you can still adjust its position a little bit because the laser toner will not smudge easily, but probably you should not be adjusting it by too much at that point. I then used a credit card to smooth out the paper and get rid of any air bubbles. And there's absolutely no wrinkling here. Then I waited 24 hours for the varnish to dry, and when it was completely dry, I used some water to make the transfer paper wet. And after waiting a few seconds for the paper to get soaked, I pulled off the paper very slowly and carefully. Look at that. The paper is almost completely white, just a few places where the toner has stuck. And all my toner is on the wood now. Beautiful. Now I just have to repeat the same process on the other half of the board. And at this point, if there are any small imperfections in the design, they can be fixed with a good old-fashioned black Sharpie. I actually tried various other kinds of pens, including some fairly expensive pigment liner markers, but all of them smudged, so I stuck with the Sharpie. On one of the boards I used a bit of wood stain mixed with varnish to shade some of the hexes and create a design. On the other boards I used a laser printer to print these shaded hexes. Sometimes there are ridges left over from the edges of the transfer paper. If these are not on your actual board design, they can be sanded off. Then I sealed the design in by applying another few coats of varnish on top of it. For the final coat, I'm switching to oil-based varnish, because I find that the water-based varnish always feels a bit sticky, even after it's completely dry. Oil-based varnish gives a nice permanent finish to the boards. And here we are. This is what the finished product looks like. Now all you need is a bunch of Go Stones, which you can buy from any game store, and you're ready to play Hex.